Okay, I think you're live.
All right. Hi, I'm Leah Newman. I'm the gallery director and curator at Davidson College. Welcome to our artist talk with Russ White. Russ is an artist, designer, and writer living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His work, whether in colored pencil, paint, or sculptural installations, often investigates complicated social themes. Russ was born in the Carolinas. He had a formative stint in Mississippi, and he earned his BA in studio art from Davidson College in 2004. And then he spent the next 10 years working in Chicago as a high-end cabinet maker. He moved to Minneapolis after marrying a native Minnesotan, and he works out of his studio in the Casket Arts building, which sounds very creepy, in the Northeast Minneapolis Arts District. He's the editor of written content for mplsart.com and editor-in-chief of In Studio Magazine, which is a biannual publication of the Northeast Minneapolis Arts Association. We're super excited to welcome you virtually. And we met Russ just about a year or so ago when
Yeah,
we
it's true.
exhibited your work in our first ever, unbelievably first ever alumni exhibition called Homecoming that included, I think, 8 alumni artists total. So we're excited to re-meet here in the virtual space.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Absolutely. So before we jump into your presentation and get really going talking about your work, I just wanted to ask you, how are you? You can't have an artist talk without some sort of COVID related question. So how are you managing to stay safe and sane?
I'm good. Thank you for having me and thank you for asking. Yeah, it's a crazy time. It's also, I think, maybe one of the weirdest things about living on this roller coaster right now for me has been how little it's actually changed my day to day, because I do often either work from home or work from my studio in isolation. And my wife works from home as well. So when this all started in March, I had this big graphic design and editing project that basically I had planned on spending the next 2 months isolated on my couch with my laptop anyway. So it hasn't been as jarring for me as it has been, I think, for a lot of other people. And for that, I feel super lucky and fortunate I've been able to stay busy through all of this. And I'm just approaching each day with a lot of gratitude for having my health and my home and my studio to come to. And then also, I think I've learned a lot about not only through COVID, but through the uprising here in Minneapolis and then across America and across the world, about how important my studio practice is to me as a means of processing everything that's going on in the world. So I've just been feeling very grateful as well for the ability to have this time to kind of work through everything that's happening and kind of get into a flow state with my own work that just kind of helps things process a little bit.
Yeah,
How are you, by the
fine.
way?
Fine, thank you.
Okay.
It's been interesting to talk with artists because so many artists say that sort of same thing, that, we're used to being in isolation. And
Mhm.
also, I think many artists are sort of, and you in particular too, are responsive to the current moment. So kind of
Yeah.
working through this time through your art seems probably normal in a lot of ways, and certainly has been providing, I imagine, some inspiration.
Oh God, there's no shortage of inspiration right now, and there hasn't been for years, unfortunately. And I mean, I've been making work that's political in nature or tied to social satire since high school. I mean, I grew up listening to really political punk and hip hop music and got into artwork through those avenues. And so having some level of social commentary, some level of engagement with what's actually happening in the world has always been a huge part of my practice. And to be honest, especially now, I don't know how it couldn't be for anyone, even if you're a plein air landscape painter. I mean, the landscape is changing and there's just no getting around it. So I think even if you're doing something that's on its surface, purely unrelated to politics or a specific moment, I think it's still, as long as you're aware and paying attention to the world, I think it's going to come through in that work.
I agree. Yeah. I think it would be hard it's been hard to focus on anything else for me.
Yeah.
Not as an artist, but from the curatorial angle. So I thought the format today could be, we'll turn over the screen to you, Russ. You could share some images about your work, kind of development over the last couple of years, and then we can come back to this sort of Q&A format if there are questions from folks watching the YouTube live. There is a little bit of a delay in the YouTube, so get your questions in and then we'll try to address them towards the end.
Sounds good.
All right, so I think you can share your screen.
All right. So I thought that what I would do is kind of share a little bit of the work I've been doing over the past few years and talk about not only my studio practice, but my professional practice. As Leah said, I graduated in 2004 as a studio art major. And I remember leaving Davidson with a head that was full of art history and full of studio experience, but I didn't really know what it meant to be a professional artist. I didn't really know what that looked like. And I think part of the reason that I didn't know that is because there isn't really one way to do it. There's no right answer. Everybody does it a little bit differently. And for my part, I'm being self-employed means that I wear a lot of different hats. So I'm an artist, I'm a graphic designer, I'm an illustrator, I'm a writer, I'm an editor for MPLS Art. And then on top of that, there's all the admin work that goes into essentially running a small business. And so art sales and grant funding are part of how I make my living, but all those other things kind of feed into that as well. So it's a balancing act. And, but I'd start today focusing on the studio practice. As Leah said, I have a studio in the Casket Arts building in Northeast Minneapolis, which is our local arts district, one of our local arts districts. There's hundreds of artists here, not only in my building, but in several old factory buildings that have been repurposed as art studios. And it is actually an old casket factory. And I think it's been around since 1882. It's super cool. And my studio is down in the basement. So it's basically like my little corner of the dungeon down here. But one of the reasons that I moved here, aside from my wife kind of getting sucked into the tractor beam that pulls all Minnesotans back and brings their spouses with them, is that I knew that there was a large community of independent artists and that I would be able to make connections, build a career, seek funding through a lot of the grant opportunities, and also have that sort of built-in audience of people who in a normal year would come by the thousands through our studio buildings for our annual crawls. So obviously it's not a normal year, but here we are. So I work primarily in colored pencil, doing these kind of obsessively detailed drawings. I've been focused on portraiture a lot. Obviously this is a self-portrait. But if you all know me, it's probably for this, which, as Leah said, was from the 2019 alumni show. This is Police Lines. So I have a lot of different lanes that I keep open in my studio practice, and one of them is sculptural installation. And this piece is about our sort of fraught relationship with law enforcement in this country and how we seem to have a hard time even just having a coherent conversation about the very real problems with law enforcement and the justice system, criminal justice system in this country, and how we can't even get to a point of finding solutions for those problems because we get so tangled up in these conversations and held up by these existing infrastructures. So a lot of my work is responsive to these problems that have existed for a very long time. And some of it is satirical, some of it is kind of focusing on the negative, but I also try to find a way to focus on beauty and try to find hope and try to find that balancing act between the two. So these portraits, including that self-portrait from before, are from a couple of years ago. This was a series of portraits I did of friends of mine inspired by coins. And the idea was to replace the presidents and dignitaries that you would normally find on money with quote unquote everyday people. People of different ages, different races, different abilities, different gender identities, and see it essentially as a celebration. And each of these are about 2 feet tall, so really incredibly detailed. Each one of these would take probably 25 or 30 hours to complete, and it's all colored pencil on painted panels. And the idea was to sort of think about portraiture through the lens of the coin and simplify it down so that it basically was just a picture of the person and then the year they were born, sort of as their mint date. But where there's a heads, there's also a tails. And so this body of work included the sort of negative side of what I see as our values. And the idea of celebrating diversity, celebrating inclusion, celebrating everything that makes humans great and interesting and beautiful and amazing, there's that question of people over profit and what do we actually value? And I think that there's a sense of people power and the beauty in that, but really our values as a society, I think, come through in policy and in our budgets and in our slogans. So we have all these slogans and we wave our flags that say these things like liberty, but at the same time, we have the highest incarceration rate in the developed world. And in this case, the end is fear. We're willing to trade our liberties and our freedoms and our open-heartedness for riot gear. So a lot of my work is about history and our place in it. I think a lot of the problems that we're facing today, we're right now in the middle of multiple concurrent crises, from COVID to systemic racism to wealth inequality to climate change, wildfires, all these things. Some of these are new, but a lot of these are very old. And I think we can tend to be very short-sighted as a people. This is a bald eagle skull. And the name of this piece is Memento Mori, thinking about how we've never really imagined that our democracy could go away, but it could, very easily could. And it's important to keep that negative in mind, I think, as sort of a way to keep us grounded and keep us focused on the positive. So on a formal note, I discovered colored pencils about 5 years ago. I've been working in lots of different media before that, but when I found colored pencils, I was like, oh my God, this is actually really amazing. I could get these really tight, controlled results with this really painterly depth of color. And as you can tell, I'm kind of a control freak, so I really enjoyed that. I didn't spend enough time in painting class playing around with brushes to get comfortable with them, but I've been drawing with pencils and pens since I was a little kid. So I'm very comfortable with that. So this piece is from 2016, and it's a series of vehicles I did that were satirical, thinking about different problems, in this case, the Iraq War and the aftermath of, and the Afghanistan War, of our foreign policy. And basically, these pieces were sort of gigantic satirical political cartoons. These were 40 by 60. And I bring these up mostly to talk about how happenstance can help build a career, and how going from one thing to the next isn't always clear how it's going to work, but I've been very fortunate in my career to have things like this happen where, so I did this series of vehicles and in 2016, and then in 2017, I was commissioned by the city of Hopkins, which is about 20 minutes outside of Minneapolis, to do 6 different designs, essentially telling the history of the town through drawings of vehicles. And this is a public art installation of laser cut steel screens. So basically I did these 6 drawings starting with tractors, because there had been a Moline tractor factory in Hopkins. And then I vectorized them and sent them in. They cut them out of this steel, and now they're on permanent display. So I thought, oh, well, that was cool. Drawing those vehicles led to this. Wasn't really expecting that. And then this, in turn, led to one of my most recent commissions, which was for the Hurt Hub at Davidson, doing the series of 5 murals for the main room and for all of the student project rooms, using the inspiration of the gears and driving belts from old machinery that was used in the cotton mill. And so that's just an example of sort of happenstance, and you never know where your career is going to go. And there's no real direct plan, but things happen, and it's amazing. So another example of happenstance, as I said, part of what I liked about moving, or what made me excited about moving to Minnesota, was that there's a really robust grant infrastructure here in the state. And I was lucky enough in 2018 to get a state arts board grant to develop this project. And so it's project-based. You submit a proposal, and then about 6 months later, they tell you whether you got it or not. And then you have about a year to complete your project. And I had been drawing pretty obsessively these orange and white traffic barricades after the 2016 election, because I had just started the series of portraits, which were this celebration of humanity, and then obviously was surprised and appalled at the results of the 2016 presidential election, and kind of felt knocked a little bit off kilter. I felt like I didn't really have a good direction. So I saw all these traffic barricades around when I was walking my dogs, and I started drawing them, and they became essentially to me symbols of the work that we had done as a society and the work that we had left to do, and then also the danger we were in and the caution that we needed to use going forward. And so after about 4 months of doing these photorealistic drawings of barricades, and then waking up every day and being horrified at each day's headlines, this was sort of how my brain felt. It was this floating ball of dangerous symbols. And I started doing these pieces, which ended up being very large. This piece is 5 feet tall, and again, it's colored pencil on a painted background, and use this as the basis for this proposal. And the proposal was to do a series of large-scale colored pencil drawings that would be taking different objects and kind of tangling them up and using them as stand-ins for other problems that we were facing in the world, and sort of our general anxiety about all of them. And this is where police lines grew out of this body of work. So I worked on this for several months, and this is another piece. This is about 4 feet tall. This is called Legacy, and it's this incredibly detailed drawing of plastic bags, which will outlast us all, unfortunately. And this drawing is big and very detailed, and it was taking, I think this took probably 100 hours or more to do. And I was starting to get frustrated. I was pleased with the results, but it was just so slow. And like I said, there's a lot going on in my professional practice. So having 100 hours straight to just knock out a drawing isn't really possible. So the project was stretching out, and I felt like I was kind of losing steam. So I was feeling frustrated. And as Leah said, I work as a writer for mplsart.com. And one of the great joys of that is that it connects me with other local artists. And I have a built-in excuse to interview other artists and write profiles on them and learn from them. So I was in the middle of an interview series at that point while I was working on all those drawings. And I was doing a profile of this local artist, Andy Doucette, and we were talking in his studio for about 2 hours. And near the end, he said he always asks his grad students, what's the R&D section of your practice? Research and development. And he said, if you don't have one, you need to go to your studio right now and treat it as a laboratory and start blowing things up. Do work that you have no idea why you're doing it. It's not related to what you think you're supposed to be doing, but just have that as part of your practice. And then, as he said, that'll be the kindling when later you need to go and make a fire. And this really knocked something loose in me when I heard that, and really changed my studio practice from there on going forward. So the very next day, I went into the studio and got out a small piece of paper and started this practice of scribbling. And this is what I would do every morning in the studio. Sometimes I would just do one, sometimes I would do several. And I only had two rules. The first was each piece of paper had to be 8 by 10. And the second was, as soon as I finished it, I had to tack it up on the wall. There was no editing. There was no throwing anything away. Even if it was absolute garbage, I thought it was stupid and ridiculous and embarrassing, I still had to put it up on the wall. And so I started, you can see there's a little bit of that, tangled floating ball theme in here. But as the series developed, I started playing around with different forms of mark making, with mixed media, and with collage. And it really affected the work that I was doing on a large scale, and it kind of brought an element of play back into my studio practice, whereas before it had been kind of, drudgery, essentially. And by the end of this project, I ended up with this wall full of these things, these little scribbles. And when I finally did have my grant show, I had like 130 of these things. And how it affected my larger work was that whereas before I had been focused on everything had to be perfect and the surface had to be pristine and I couldn't make any mistakes and it's very hard to erase colored pencils, so I better not screw up, and just all this pressure for everything to be perfect. And I'd wanted to move the tangles into bodies and start thinking about bodies and control and intimacy and different issues. And I thought, you know what, before I even start this drawing, I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to ball it up. I'm going to crumple it up and then I'm going to flatten it out and then I'll do my drawing on that. And worst case scenario, I do a crappy drawing on a crappy piece of paper and life goes on. And then I ended up actually doing what I think is pretty good drawing, and had to figure out how to flatten it out and get it framed and all that. But it took the pressure off of this has to be perfect and this has to go in my show and I can't make any mistakes. And it also completely changed the way that I worked at the drawing table. So, I used to be a cabinet maker in Chicago for several years. And what I loved about that job, aside from it being hands-on and building things and you can see what you've done at the end of the day, is that it was pretty cut and dry. We're going to build a kitchen today. Here are the plans to the kitchen. Go build it. Okay, we've got the boxes. Here's the plans for where they go. Go install them. I appreciated that, and then I realized, man, this is what I'm doing with my drawings. Is that I'm setting up my source imagery. I'm figuring out exactly what my color palette is going to be. I've got the picture of the person I'm going to draw or the situation I'm going to draw, and then I would just hand myself the plans and execute. And it was very meditative. I mean, it's amazing how you can get into that state and time kind of melts away, even if you spend 8 hours and you've drawn like this much. But I wasn't being present, at least as present in the big picture of each piece as I had to be in this case, because this wasn't planned out. I knew where all the arms were going to go, but I didn't really know what the colors were going to be. I didn't know how much rendering I was going to do. If you look on the left-hand side of this piece, the red arm and the white arm, you can see that's where I started, and they're like super rendered. And I got to the wrist on both of them, and I said, da, 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 stop, stop, stop. I'm missing the point. And I had to force myself to just, da, 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 let's just scribble it. And after, it was painful, but after I got a couple of hands in, I thought, oh my God, this has energy again. This feels like drawing in a way where everything else prior had felt like rendering. And the other thing that I discovered through that R&D practice was actually a rediscovery of collage. So all throughout high school, because of my interest in Dead Kennedys and the artwork that was in their liner notes, I got really into collage. And I did it pretty much nonstop for about 3 years. And then I kind of abandoned it in college and focused more on sculpture. But through cutting up these pieces of paper and then having this little pile of scraps and playing with those, suddenly I rediscovered, oh my God, this is so much fun playing with these. And I developed this whole series of portraits and figure studies using collage and playing with this like color blocking and trying again to figure out what can I learn about expression and about portraiture that could be interesting. So that was something that, if you had asked me before I went in, when I was in the middle of those drawings, what I'd be doing in a year, I never would have guessed I'd be making collages. But that's something where just being in the studio and playing led me down this completely unexpected path. So this is a recent installation I did back in March, inspired by those silhouette portraits, those cut paper shadow portraits that were really popular in the 19th century as a really cheap, simple way for people who weren't rich to have a portrait done. And obviously, Kara Walker has used this quite a bit in her work and popularized it. But I wanted to think about, well, the basic idea was, what would it be like to create a rainbow of these? Because you always see them in black and white. And in terms of identity, which is part of what the coin series had been investigating, what can you do with a single line? And how much information can you get about a person if you reduce their image to this single line, a single shape? How much can you learn about them? Can you relate to them more or less than others because of that? And just kind of raising those questions. And I'm not really sure if this piece was successful. I think so, I'm not sure. And that was part of that exhibition, was like, I just want to put this up and see what happens. And so that's another area of play that's opened up a little bit more, where I'm loosening that sense of control over what an exhibition needs to be. But one of the craziest things about this was, okay, so I cut out everybody's head, and then I had all the paper scraps and I was throwing them on my scrap pile. I get them out of the way, I'm working over here. And then I looked down and I saw this, and I was like, oh my God, that's actually really compelling, because I had randomly stacked all of the negative cutoffs on top of each other, and ended up developing this short little series of cutoff portraits that, again, was an exercise in staying present, where I just sort of was more engaged in playful awareness in the studio, and what it led to, instead of having this perfect grand scheme of exactly how it was going to work out. So basically, there's been this evolution in my work from this really tightly controlled rendering into something that then has become a little bit more, well, I guess at first it loosened up conceptually, where I started to think about what is a portrait and what can a portrait be. I mean, this is Steve. This is my friend Steve. This is a picture of Steve. And it's great. And I love this drawing, but who is this a picture of? I don't know. Does this count as a portrait? To me, it's a piece about how basically we're all a steaming hot mess. And it was another example of playing. This is, basically an impromptu wire sculpture I did and took photos of. And so it's a drawing of a photograph of a sculpture. And I did the drawing in the most rigorous photorealistic way I could of this thing that I did completely randomly in about 2 seconds. So playing around with that, what are the implications of that for portraiture and for how we understand ourselves? And then I think the work also loosened up formally, to where I'm now really interested in trying to find that balance between chaos and control, between skill and intuition, between that sort of meditative rendering that I really love to fall into that while I'm working, and get lost in somebody's face, get lost in their freckles and pimples and pores and wrinkles, but then also stand back and kind of force myself to make decisions about where this drawing is going to go in that moment, and in a way that where there's kind of no turning back. And this is what it's led to right now. This is probably the most recent body of work that I started in June, thinking about racial identity and what it means to be white, and whether that's an identity or a performance, and what goes into that. What does it mean to be a white person now? Because that's what I am, that's what I know, and I think it's worth investigating. And this is house paint on a painted panel. This is, I think, 24 by 32. And it led into this whole series I did of just, starting with accident and then working backwards from there to kind of figure out who we are, or at least ask the questions of who we are, and what imagery do you end up creating when you don't have words? And where do you go when you don't know what the right answer is, or even necessarily what the right question is? So that's kind of where I am at right now. And it's all very silly that we're artists, I think. It's kind of amazing. And this is a GIF that I like to send to friends of mine whenever we're talking about how ridiculous the art world is. And it cracks me up every time, because it's ridiculous, but it's also kind of true. I mean, this is kind of what we're doing, is we're just running headlong at the piece of paper or the canvas or the sculpture and seeing what happens. And then we have, hopefully, this audience or this group of friends who are, I hope, getting something out of it. And it's silly and amazing and fantastic, and I wouldn't do any other way. So I'm going to end with some life lessons, some advice that nobody asked for. And the first one, if you'll indulge me, the first one is life is short, but it takes a long time. And so in terms of professional practice, that means that life is too short to get stuck into a rut doing something that you absolutely hate doing. So plan strategically to do things that you love, but be smart about it. So keep your overhead low, pack a lunch every day. Do things strategically, like try to insert yourself into a community that is going to help you reach your goals and uplift you throughout what you're doing. The next one is be excited about your work, because if you're not excited about your work, ain't nobody else going to be. And I found through the R&D practice, but also just in my general studio practice, that boredom has actually been a really great instigator for me. Because if I find myself getting bored with something that I'm working on, I think it's going to show up in the final piece. And so if I can transition from what I'm bored by and follow the trail of what I'm excited about, the work is going to be that much better. And again, that goes to that sense of play and that sense of discovery. But I think it also relates well to doing client work and commission work, where the successes that I've had working with clients on work that I didn't start myself was where I was able to find some way for myself to get excited about it. So whether it's, this cool font that I just discovered that I'm going to use in this layout for a poster or a magazine or whatever, or I get really invested in, doing research on the Hurt Hub and, what the history of the cotton mill was, things like that. If you can find a way, even in, I think this is true probably in homework, if you can find a way to get excited about a subject, then the essay that you have to write anyway is going to be that much better. So trust your instincts and stay excited. And while you're doing that, make bad work. Make lots of it. The more bad work you make, the more good work you'll make. I spent pretty much all 4 years at Davidson making really bad work. And I spent several years afterwards making really bad work. And I still make really bad work all the time. And the trick is you just work through it. I remember Ira Glass from This American Life had a really great quote about how when you're starting out, there's sort of your taste level and there's your skill level. And when you start, your taste level is really high. You know what you like. You like really good things. And that's the stuff that's inspiring you to make the things that you want to make. But when you're starting out, your skill level is relatively low. You don't have the skills yet to do it. And so you look at your work and you say, God, this just isn't good enough. And the trick is you keep making work and you'll be surprised that sooner or later it actually catches up to your taste level. And I guess that's sort of the fake it till you make it thing. But it's also just about not putting as much pressure on yourself. It's okay, just keep working, work through it. The only way out is through. While you're making bad work, you're also gonna be trying to further your career and you're gonna get rejected probably a lot. Even if you make good work, you're going to get rejected a lot. And so this is why I tell people, if you're not getting rejected, you're not doing your job. Because part of your job as an artist is to put yourself out there, to apply for things that you don't think you're ready for yet. And you may not be ready for them yet. There's one show here that has an annual call, I guess, well, it happens about 3 times a year, and it's a beautiful space, and I've applied for it 6 or 7 times, and I've been rejected every single time. And it stings, but man, I'm really glad that I didn't get picked that first time, because that 7th proposal is way better than that first proposal was. I was not ready. And obviously I wasn't ready on the 7th time either. So maybe on the 8th or the 9th or the 10th, it will get to that point where, okay, now it's good. And so there's something that you can learn from that rejection. And there's also the sense that, like, people are people. Taste is taste. There's no accounting for it. A lot of times things just come down to who the juror is. I've had things where I've had the best drawing I've ever made and I'm super proud of it, and it gets shot down for a show. And you're like, okay, well, I guess it's not going to be in that show. And then a month later, hey, it got accepted to another show. Great. There's a ton of opportunities out there, and you're not going to get all of them, which leads me to my next one, which is that especially if you're in a community, as I am, where there's sort of a finite amount of resources, a finite amount of opportunity, while you're getting rejected, friends of yours are going to get accepted. And the trick here is don't feel envy, feel inspired. Be happy for them. Be excited for them, for their successes, and show up for them when they have good days, because then they'll show up for you when you have successes and when you have good days. And it's also just, I think, about keeping a positive attitude and not not letting anything become too toxic. Towards that end, this is the most important probably of anything, and probably the thing I have the hardest time with, which is stay healthy and take care of yourself. Part of that is getting enough sleep, eating right, exercising. You know, it's really easy when you have a career that's built around something that you love, and also something that is built so much in hustle. It's easy to become a workaholic, and I've fallen into that trap quite a bit. I mean, that's kind of where I live. But it's really important to make time for yourself, make time for your family, and to show up and relax when you can. I've also found it's part of that self-care is visualizing your goals and thinking like, well, what do I want? Where do I want this to go? What am I insecure about, and how can I turn that into what I'm aspiring for? And one thing that I've done, it sounds a little woo-woo, but pick a mantra and have that in your back pocket, so that, you know, if it's something about how you're going to make better work, or something about how you're going to make more money, or something about how you're going to get financial independence, or become a better person, or, you know, even for a while, one of mine was, I'm almost 40. And that was a way for me to remind myself of two things, which was, I'm a grown-ass man. I know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm doing, and it's all good. And also, man, the clock is ticking. Let's get busy. And so it was sort of worked those two angles. And then one of the greatest lessons I've learned since being here in Minneapolis and sort of jumping in for the past 6 years to being self-employed full-time. You know, when I was in Chicago, I was working as a cabinet maker. I was making art nights and weekends. And I was super intimidated by the art world. And I would never approach anybody who ran a gallery about my work. I was nervous. I didn't think that I was ready. And they intimidated me. But when I moved here, and this was what I was pursuing full-time, I didn't have a choice. And I had to bite that bullet and invite people for studio visits and introduce myself and go to shows and shake people's hands and stop apologizing for being an artist and just be an artist. And it helped me realize that, oh, these people that are so successful, they're not that scary, actually. And I realized we're all doing this for the first time. We're all deeply insecure. We all, as successful as we look and we sound from the outside, we're all racked with fears and doubts that you would never guess we have. And that kind of takes the edge off. You're like, oh, it's okay. It's all good. We're going to be okay. Let's just do this thing. And then, and this takes me to the final little life lesson, which was a piece of advice that a friend of mine gave me when I was installing a show at his gallery. I had hauled all the work in. I was putting together, this was some of the barricade works. I was trying to, you know, put together the nuts and bolts of these things. And the stuff wasn't fitting, and I couldn't get the things on this. I'm down on the floor struggling with this. And he just kind of walked up and he tapped me on the shoulder and he set a beer down beside me and he said, remember, this is supposed to be fun. I was like, oh, right. This was the whole reason I've been doing this since I was a kid. And I think that even when we're tackling these issues that are deadly serious and deeply important, and we're coming into work every single day and we're putting in those hours, that if we approach it with a sense of joy and gratitude, I think it'll show in the work, and I think it will end up making the work and just life in general that much better. So that's sort of the rough overview of everything that I've done. The only thing I want to make sure I get in there, because I think probably everybody listening to this is 18 or older at this point, is please vote. Please vote. Please vote. People fought and died for the right to vote in this country, and people are still to this day having their vote suppressed. Either because of a criminal record or because of gerrymandering or because of outright voter suppression or being purged from voter rolls. So we all have a voice and we all need to use it. And, I was 18 years old when I started at Davidson in the year 2000, and I didn't vote in that election. And I regret it to this day because I thought, well, there's no big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. They're all the same. So it doesn't matter. Well, it turns out it does. And the only thing I would say, vote for who you feel like you need to vote for, but please do it strategically. And please remember whatever privileges that you have in your life, you need to work to use them to help people who don't have that privilege and don't have that voice. And what I like to tell people and remind people of is that the lesser of two evils is still less evil. So that's my electioneering. I'll stop there. And that's my work. So thank you for indulging me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have a lot to think about. You've given me a lot to think about in just thinking about a portrait exhibition that we have coming up and going through some of those portraits and some of your questions that you were asking when you were making that work is good for me to sort of hear and think about right now. Also, I'm glad we share punk. We have that in common.
Yes.
There are a few questions, although it sounds like one of them you answered fully because it was around advice for art students and how they sort of prepare for a professional career. And I think you have really given some really great advice for artists and also life advice around voting and things like that.
Oh, good.
But another question that I had, which I think maybe feeds in a little bit to another question, was thinking about the work you mentioned, particularly with the coin series, thinking about beauty and hope. And the works are often tackling such difficult subjects, but they don't read that way initially. And that's obviously really intentional, that the aesthetic of the works makes them approachable and accessible so that, I'm thinking about like sensationalistic media images or something of a difficult situation. And you're obviously not approaching it that way intentionally. So I would imagine so that the works become more accessible and that people will have a way in to these difficult topics. And Elizabeth, there seems like there's a question that's sort of related to that, I think.
Yeah, Paul wanted to know, how do you stay playful and spontaneous when it comes to really intense political issues that you want to explore?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the playfulness comes on the formal side. People have asked me where I get inspiration from, and as I said, there's no shortage of it, unfortunately, when you're talking about problems in the world. But I try to just keep my antenna up in general for ideas, either in terms of how best to illustrate an idea or a situation, sort of in the sense of like almost a graphic design question or agitprop. And it's something that I guess I've gotten a little bit away from. Maybe that's part of why I'm so interested in portraiture right now, is that I feel like I have a lot more questions than answers right now. And when I'm approaching some of these really intense issues, I just am so bored of snark. I just think that there's a lot of snark out there in the world. There's sort of the Twitter feedification of everything where you have to have, some smart, witty little thing. And that's not where my head's at right now. So in terms of the playfulness, I think I'm approaching it sort of from a human expression standpoint, if that makes sense. Like I'm trying to find those moments in people's eyes, or in the way that they hold their mouth, or the way that they're looking at the camera or something. And how can that individual's expression kind of be extrapolated to a larger issue, whether it's around sexism or racism, or any kind of in the realm of identity, or the way that we relate to each other. So I don't know. I mean, I think the playfulness sort of becomes, it can be something that lives in your sketchbook. It can be something that lives on your drawing table. And it can take different forms. Sometimes I'm playing with color, sometimes I'm playing with expression, sometimes I'm playing with mark. And it's kind of a challenge sometimes to stay playful and stay positive. When you wake up and the first thing you get is the New York Times email in the morning, it's kind of a bummer.
Understood. I love the way that you talked about like the marriage sort of between the process or techniques and the concepts of the work. So just thinking about these works that are both about and made in that way. So like they're about chaos and accident and control versus, and then the process is mirrored through that. So this like beautiful balance of relying on your intuition, but then also these really detailed technical kind of things, and this like internal fight that you're having around like tightness and loose. And
right.
I found that really interesting. And this sort of R&D idea, just letting things go and trying to figure it out. And you mentioned earlier that there's like, artists are used to being isolated in some ways, but actually as a student, that would not necessarily be true, right? That right. Being around other students, making things, and having faculty and other students constantly sort of looking and evaluating what you're doing. And then you mentioned, this conversation with Andy and how it really put you on this other path and changed things. So although you probably spent a lot of time isolated in your studio, is there a lot of, what are the benefits of being in a place like Casket Arts where there are other artists? How much interaction do you have with those artists?
Oh, a lot. Less so recently because I kind of come in and go straight down. I don't want to have to wash my hands 1,000 times a day, but I still run into people in the hallway. And, it's interesting because there's probably 100 different studios in this building, and all artists doing all different kinds of work, and painters and sculptors and printmakers. But a lot of them are friends of mine, and so I'll have an impromptu studio visit with somebody and bring them down and just show them what I'm working on and be like, this is what I've made, and I don't know what the hell it is. And that's part of, I think, what I miss the most about being in a classroom setting is that I always love the crits because I think you learn something about yourself as an artist and as a viewer when you have your work and somebody else's work there, and you can talk and try to find the words for what it's doing to you, what you're picking up, what they intended. And it's also, that's another thing when you're talking, you were talking earlier about my intentions for the work, and the reason that I chose a certain way to render something or do something. And a lot of that is just me living in my own head, and this is how it makes sense to me. I try to think about the audience, but not to a debilitating degree. And I'm always interested about how other people perceive my work. So, I've done, that the most recent series of all the splatters, for me is all about whiteness. And I think for somebody else who maybe didn't read the caption on Instagram or something, they would just think it's, maybe it's about mental illness, or maybe it's about something else that they find relates to their life, or maybe they don't get it at all. And that's fine. That's just the way it's going to be, that people are going to pick up different things about the work and relate it to their own lives and their own experiences in different ways. And, I'm open to that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I miss people. I haven't hugged a friend in 6 months or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah. When you were talking about the response of other folks, and obviously people read what they read into it, they bring their own experiences. Thinking about some more of the difficult works, I'm just trying to think about, I'm trying to think about how to phrase this too, but the work that we showed, for example, the installation with the wallpaper, the endosphere, and the police lines barricade, that was made, that show was over a year ago, and the work was made earlier. Living in Minneapolis, you have obviously been looking at the policing in Minneapolis long before George Floyd and recognizing problems nationally and particularly in that community. And I guess I'm wondering about a couple of things. One is like, how do you make work, and maybe this ties in a little bit to like making this kind of work as a white person, but how do you make work that is not performative, that's not exploiting other people? Like what's your thoughts as you're making these kind of works? And also, what does it mean to make something, sort of a few years ahead of like where suddenly this work becomes so relevant? It was relevant before, but now it's sort of publicly, people see it in a different way. I don't know if I'm asking the question properly, but
no, I get it. I think what's interesting about the COVID crisis and about the uprising after George Floyd's murder is how it has shown a very direct light on these problems that we've had for centuries. And I don't think of that piece as being ahead of its time in any way at all, because these are problems that go back to the origins of policing and the origins of slavery in America. And
very true.
Yeah, all these problems that we've never had the guts to actually look at and talk about and own in any real way as a country. And as people, we've always kind of kicked the can down the road and kind of kicked the can behind us. So, well, that was all in the past. And I think what these two particular crises are showing is that the past is very much present. In terms of making work about what we call sensitive topics, I think the most important thing is honesty and coming at these problems in earnest and in a way that is not exploiting other people's experiences and other people's pain, is working out of my own experience and my own interest. I'm not trying to grandstand and take attention. I think part of what's great about living and working in this community and then covering it for MPLS Art is being able to share a platform and highlight people whose work I think is fantastic and interesting and might otherwise be overlooked. And I think that having that sense of humility going into any kind of work about these problems, especially when they're not ones, I've never been arrested. I got pulled over once in high school and was issued a warning. Whereas, people that I've talked to have been pulled over dozens of times. One friend of mine told me his count was up to 65 at one point, and he's only a few years older than me. And so recognizing, that level of privilege in my life and in my work, I think is very important. And yeah, I guess just you got to come at it, you got to be real. And, some of the backlash that we've seen in recent years, sort of on high profile art world blunders, has been about making a spectacle of other people's pain. And, you need to be aware. Like I said earlier, you don't want your awareness of audience to cripple you and have you hold you back in any way from exploring different things in your studio practice, but especially when it comes to a curatorial practice or an exhibition practice, that is performative. That is like, I mean, we don't like to think of it this way, but that is show business. And that's why we call them shows. Mm-hmm. And there's a responsibility to our audience and to the discourse that comes with that. So, you know, thinking about the Dana Schutz's painting of Emmett Till's open casket. It's like, okay, well, fine, do that in your studio, but I don't know that that needs to go in the Whitney Biennial. I don't know that that adds anything to the conversation short of elevating your status as a white artist. You know, for all the Black Lives Matter signs, you know, I've also seen Black Joy Matters, and I think that's something to remember as well, that we cannot focus on purely on people's pain, because that as well is dehumanizing. And so there's, I think, again, that just goes to being real and being authentic and not taking up too much space, you know?
Yeah. I feel like we could have a much longer conversation about all of that, and we probably will at some point.
And we should.
But I wanted to ask one last question, which was, I'm glad that you shared, obviously, the project at the Hurt Hub, which was part of the reason that we thought about doing this talk, was to kind of connect the work that people may have seen in the gallery, sort of your fine art practice, with this newer practice, or new project, which is maybe a little more of the commercial work that you're doing. And you talked about other public art projects and writing, which I think is great, particularly for students to hear the way that artists sort of piece together different things. But the public art project, both at the Hurt Hub and the other one you shared, you've done such a great job of sort of being true to your own interests or work that you were already making, and thinking about interrogating like different difficult situations and different systems. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people don't think about public art in that way. They can't visualize how to take the work that they're already making. And so I don't know if you have any info or tips sort of around that, but I feel like the works, not just like the aesthetic of it, but mm-hmm. you seem to be able to stay true to sort of your work in some way.
Well, thank you. I think that's part of that being excited life lesson that I was talking about. Like, you know, you could be hired. I'm working on a couple of commissions right now, and it's not anything that I would normally do. They're illustration commissions, but as long as I can find, you know, some kernel of thing in there that I can get excited about, then it's going to turn out well. And I've been very lucky with both the Hurt Hub and the Hopkins commissions, that those presented themselves sort of, I was surprised to have both of those opportunities. And I was very lucky with how well they fit so perfectly into where I was and what I had been doing in my own personal work. And that doesn't always happen. And I definitely don't have the experience enough to call myself a public artist, you know, even though I have, you know, a couple of pieces now under my belt. But, you know, I think you got to approach every opportunity and every piece a little bit strategically and a little bit aspirationally. So you think, what could this be? What should this be? What can this be? And what are the opportunities to make this freaking awesome? And how can I do that? And then when you sit down and do it, you'll end up most likely doing it in your own way. And I think that's, you know, you might have noticed over the course of my presentation, my work has sort of morphed and changed and evolved, and I have lots of different avenues. I kind of think of my studio practice as sort of like a multi-lane highway, where I'm like moving from portraiture to sculpture to drawing to collage, and kind of shifting lane, some traffic is slower than others. And I remember, I think it was Herb Jackson said in a painting class one time that, one good idea can last a decade for an artist, and you'll just get stuck on something and you'll do that for 10 years straight. I haven't quite found that idea, I guess, because I keep kind of bouncing around. And I've heard the advice that, artists should have a voice, or they should have a style, and that there should be, make it so it's, clearly recognizable from across the room. That's a Russ White, and maybe I'm doing that, but I think it's more important to have a consistent voice. And when you're working as an artist, whether it's in sculpture or printmaking or conceptual work or dance or theater or whatever, going through years and years of work and working on different things and working on things for different people, for different clients, you'll be surprised you realize you're singing lots of different songs, but it's actually all coming through in your voice.
That is definitely true of your work. So,
well, thanks.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think that we hit on all of the questions, but Elizabeth is here, our gallery and collection coordinator. And I think there were just a couple of comments in the chat too that we'd like to share.
Sure.
Yeah, Adrienne Lee says, thank you for so many inspiring words. And Sherry Nelson commented that your murals are wonderful.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Yeah, I haven't actually, they just got installed, I don't know, like 2 weeks ago or something like that. So I have not yet seen them in person. So I hope that people enjoy them. I hope it kind of livens up the space, and students especially maybe will feel more excited about working in those rooms and being in that space. And I don't know, I hope so.
Happy to have your mark on our campus. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anything, last things? You offered so much good advice. Anything else to say?
Just vote and pay attention and get back to work.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll talk to
thank you.
soon.